In this video, I'm going to finally, once and for all, explain what Sony's Cine EI feature is and how you use it. Now, there's some resources on YouTube, and probably the best one I've seen is actually from Sony, linked to in the description down below. Now, I'm not going to make you wait for it. Cine EI simply means retaining low light details. That's it. It's an obscure name Sony's given to a good practice. So how do we use Cine EI? Now, I'm using the Sony FX30, and like most modern camera sensors, it features dual native ISOs, in this case 800 and 2500. And this takes us to our first key point. Native ISO in the Cine EI workflow has nothing to do with noise levels on their own. It's noise plus latitude. Practically speaking, this means if your primary concern is the least in-camera noise, just shoot at the lowest ISO possible, say 100. The problem is this reduced noise comes at the expense of latitude, which is a dynamic range. That's why on Sony cameras, you can't even use Cine EI with the lowest ISO on the camera because Cine EI locks you to the sensor's native ISOs. And that takes us to our second key point. The native ISOs for your camera are simply the ones where you get the best combination, the keyword there, of noise and latitude. So noise and latitude. You trade some noise for greater dynamic range. And by locking into the native ISOs, Cine EI ensures the camera's maximum performance is achieved. So let's put this together with a practical example. So in pretty much any scene, lighting is a means to set mood or to help us focus on a subject. Easy enough? Here's both. This takes us to key point number 3. Most modern digital cameras are fantastic in most ways except for low light noise. Below a certain IRE, noise increases dramatically, leading to dark parts of the image looking pixelated and mushy. More precisely, and more importantly, we lose detail in the dark areas. Now in this scene, we've correctly exposed for our subject, so to really understand the benefit of Cine EI, we need to focus on the dark areas. As you can see, pretty much anywhere we don't have a direct light has noise and lacks detail. This is easy to see in the so-called false color mode of my external monitor. For the FX30, these areas pretty much match up with anything below 30 IRE. Now the kicker is Sony knows this. So the Cine EI workflow starts with you exposing your entire scene correctly, then adding 2 full stops using additional lights or reducing ND. The idea here being that adding 4 times more light to even the darkest of scenes is generally enough to bring all those areas into the sensor's clean zone. Now this varies by camera and sensor of course, but again for the FX30, I found that's pretty much anything above 30 IRE. Of course, shooting like this results in an overexposed image, so the final part of the workflow is dropping exposure by 2 stops or more, whatever your preference is, in post. Of course, this goes without saying, but this means your scene has to allow for those 2 extra stops. In controlled lighting situations, this shouldn't really be an issue, but it clearly doesn't work for all cases, so just keep that in mind. Now for me, the easiest workflow is to slap a variable ND filter on your lens and set it a few notches under the highest stop or darkest setting. Expose the scene to your liking, and when done, simply reduce ND by 2 stops. This is easy to do using the exposure meter in your camera. As soon as it hits +2, we're good to go. Now, even though this isn't an exposure tutorial, just for quick reference, for S-Log3, gray card exposure can be found using zebras when set to 41. On my external monitor, when the gray bar turns light blue. Whichever method you use, just make sure you're exposing your scene properly, even when using Cine EI mode. Now I've done just that here. Notice how the background goes from around 20 IRE to 50, well within the clean range of the sensor. Note how my camera's exposure indicator also says +2, aka 2 stops. The final result, honestly, is night and day. Dark areas are much cleaner and feature much more detail. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second and state the obvious one more time. The more flexible your lighting, the easier Cine EI is. In this example, all I did was drop 2 stops of ND, but it's also equally valid to not have an ND filter and just instead increase or add more light to your scene. Now this sounds easy, but it means you'll probably need much more powerful and flexible lights, which can be expensive, harder to manage, and honestly just harder to move and set up around your scene. Now, as nice as it is to have cleaner images with more detail, we need to talk about some of Cine EI's flaws. First is we're of course intentionally overexposing our footage, which adds additional work in post. Second, we still need to be able to preview our final look when shooting, and that's where the extra task of setting exposure index comes in. Now, exposure index is a little bit confusing sounding. It's actually really simple. It's simply a way for us to correct our over or underexposed image when shooting. It's basically saying, look, I'm going to be changing exposure in post, so to know what that image looks like, I'll simulate it when shooting. And that's where a huge point comes in. Exposure index only affects your monitor, not the recording. What we record is the base ISO. If 800, that means recording EI 800. If 2500, EI 2500. Anything above or below those numbers is simply matching for the ISO that we want to achieve in post. And that's Cine EI. It's simply Sony's way of telling us that its sensors aren't perfect yet, and if we want the cleanest images with the most detail, you've got to feed the sensor plenty of light. Because of this, I would almost present an alternative workflow. Do some test shots and find the lowest IRE with the least amount of noise and most detail. Then, when lighting a scene, make sure nothing drops below that. This way, we don't need to mess around with changing ND filters or adding additional lights. We simply light for the sensor. Because of this, I'd actually much prefer Sony integrating false colors into their on-camera display or providing a separate noise warning system similar to that of Focus. Basically, anything below an IRE value we choose shows up in like red or something like that. So anyway, let's wrap up. The big takeaway is the goal of Cine EI is to retain detail in dark and shadowed areas. The reduction of noise is a nice side effect, but if your final deliverable is like YouTube, it almost never matters anyway. Compression crushes it anyway, and your editing program always has noise reduction filters. That's why it's all about preserving detail. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. As always, please let me know how you did in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.